Welcome everybody to today's VLTA webinar, General Assembly 101. Our General Assembly 101 training features Jim Pickral, Pickral Consulting, and Katherine Crawford, VLTA Past President, who will share the basics of the General Assembly, how bills become laws, and how to keep up with the legislative action in the VLTA Legislative Process. Before we get started, here are some housekeeping items. On your control panel, you will see three icons, one of which being a question mark. When you have a question, please sure to add them to the questions box for the presenters to address. There's also a chat feature as well if you are unable to do the questions feature. We encourage you to ask these questions throughout the presentation so that we may address them as we go. There will also be a dedicated time for questions at the conclusion of the session. Katherine and James, the stage is now yours.
Thank you. So welcome everybody. We're excited to do this. As you know, my name is James Pickral. I've been the lobbyist for VLTA for I think 8 years, maybe 9. This will be my 24th session of the General Assembly, having spent 3 years as a legislative assistant and the rest of that time as lobbying. So what we're going to really go through here today, we're going to go through the very basics of the General Assembly. We're going to go through the committee structure. We're going to go through how a bill becomes a law. Tips on effective advocacy, websites you can get information from, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the state budget and our recent elections, which were rather historic. So if we're all ready to begin, Katherine, if you could advance to the first slide.
Maybe, if my computer will work. Oh, there we go. All yours.
Right. Great. So Virginia has a bicameral legislature, as do 48 other states. And so our lower house, though they don't like to be called that, is called the House of Delegates. It consists of 100 members. They're referred to as delegates, and each delegate represents roughly 80,000 citizens. Delegates are elected for 2-year terms, which is quite a short turnaround. There are no term limits, and the Speaker of the House is the presiding officer. Unlike in the Senate, which we'll talk about later, the Speaker of the House is elected from among the membership of the House of Delegates. So if Democrats control the chamber as they do now, you will have a Democratic speaker, and the opposite is true when Republicans control the chamber. You'll see the annual salary of the House of Delegates is very low, $17,640. Virginia does that on purpose because we pride ourselves in not having a professional legislature, though they most likely have gone that way in recent times. But we like to think that we have a citizen legislature. So that we have folk that are living and working out in the community just like everybody else, and we think that is a better way to garner representation for the Commonwealth. Currently, because of the recent elections on November 7th, Republicans have lost control of the House of Delegates. So we have now 48 Republicans, 51 Democrats. Yesterday, Delegate Les Adams retired, even though he had been reelected in November. So the governor has called a special election for January 9th that effectively takes down the seats to 47 Republicans, 51 Democrats, but Delegate Adams' seat is reliably Republican, so we expect a Republican to be elected there on the 9th. Next slide, Katherine. Senate of Virginia, which is our upper chamber, consists of 40 members referred to as senators. You'll see there are many fewer senators than there are delegates. And that's because we're based on geographics. Our legislative districts are based on geography and not necessarily population. Each senator you'll see represents many more citizens than the members of the House of Delegates do, 200,000. And senators have the luxury of serving 4-year terms. So they are in effect not running for re-election every other year. There are no term limits. The Lieutenant Governor is the presiding officer. And unlike the Speaker of the House, the people of the Commonwealth elect the Lieutenant Governor. You'll see that even though senators represent more than 3 times, more than twice the number of citizens the House represents, they're only paid a little bit more, 18,000. Democrats also control the Senate of Virginia, 21 Democrats, 19 Republicans. Democrats controlled the Senate prior to the November 7th elections, but they actually lost 1 seat. So very slim 1-seat majorities for Democrats in both the House and the Senate. The Lieutenant Governor, as a presiding officer, votes only in the case of a tie, but not always. Lieutenant governors cannot vote on matters of the Constitution, matters of taxation, or the selection of judges. Next slide, Catherine. So now we're going to get into the legislative process, and this is a very simplified sort of path. So as you know, we just talked about the two chambers of the General Assembly, the House of Delegates and the Senate, and most bills follow a pretty standard path. They're introduced in their chamber of origin. So if Delegate Hope out of Arlington wanted to introduce a bill, it would of course be heard in the House of Delegates first. Bills are then sent to committees, and we'll talk about the committee structure a little bit later. In the House, they are always sent to subcommittees unless they're very non-controversial, and that rarely happens. The Senate also has subcommittees, but they use them much less than the House of Delegates does, and we'll talk about that a little bit also. After you get through subcommittee and committee, if your bill survives, it goes to the floor of the Chamber of Origin, so in this case, the House of Delegates, where the House of Delegates will vote on your bill, whether to advance it or whether to not advance it. If your bill is advanced, then it goes into what we call crossover, which means it goes to the opposite chamber where it starts this process all over again. So each bill not only has to survive the committee process and the floor of its chamber of origin, it also has to survive the committee process and the floor in the opposite chamber. Go ahead, Catherine. So why do we have committees? Committees are broken down by subject matter. And so as VLTA, there are a couple of committees that are important to us and the other committees are less so. One of our important committees is Courts of Justice. Bills dealing with criminal and civil legal matters are all sent to Courts of Justice. Some of the other committees that are important to us, but usually not as important of Courts of Justice, the Finance Committee, which deals with taxation. So anything to do with the recordation tax, for example, whether to increase or decrease that would go through the Finance Committee first. Appropriations is another one. That's where we decide how we're going to spend the Commonwealth's money. So if finance wanted to increase the recordation tax, appropriations would then decide how to spend it. Committees are broken down further by subcommittees, and this is really to refine the subject area of the parent committee. So in the House, Courts of Justice is broken down into two subcommittees. They used to be called the criminal sub and the civil sub, but now they are subcommittee 1 and subcommittee 2, though they serve the exact same function. So just as it sounds, all criminal matters go to the criminal subcommittee, all civil matters go to the civil subcommittee. In the House of Delegates, you have to pass out of your subcommittee to advance over to the full committee and have the bills still be considered for future legislative action. Go ahead, Catherine. So tracking legislation. How does a bill get on VLTA's bill list? So this year, bills became publicly available on November 20th, and that's really, really late. And the reason that happened was because both the House and the Senate had to stand for re-election on November 7th of last year, November 7th of this year. Usually bills become available in mid-July, and so you have a lot of time to look at bills and review bills and decide what you want to do with them. This time it's been very truncated, and in fact there are probably only maybe 25 bills on the system right now, and we expect around 3,000, maybe a little bit more. So there's going to be a lot of bills that are going to drop fairly soon, and so the VLTA Legislative Committee, I think, is probably going to be pretty busy in review. So once bills begin appearing, I check the bill list every day, and I will identify the bills that I think are of interest to VLTA, and I try to cast a pretty wide net on that, and then it's sent to the chair of the Legislative Committee for his review and the entirety of the Legislative Committee's review. If the Legislative Committee verifies that it is indeed of interest, either in a good way or a bad way to VLTA, then we develop a position, and that bill is permanently added to our bill list. And the bill list is what we use to track legislation as it moves through the General Assembly session. Go ahead, Catherine. So, Catherine, I think this is where I hand it over to you.
Sure. So as we identify bills, and just as James said, there are just so many bills that he has to go through to try and determine if it is an interest to our industry. And you have to remember that our industry casts a very large and wide net over things. So we're looking at anything that has to do with the recordation system, the clerk's offices, whether they're putting legislation forward to change the way something is done. So that includes e-notarization, electronic recordings, and then it reaches very far and wide as to criminal statutes dealing with criminal restitution fines, liens. That touches us. Whether there are taxation exemptions for certain types of instruments recorded, family law, divorce, whether something is done to change the way property is titled subsequent to a divorce. So it is not as simple as just looking for legislation that has the word deed or clerk or, you know, judgment in the name of it. So that is why we need such a robust legislative committee, and we need folks that are willing to help comb through the legislation that James has identified, because, you know, he's taking a very large vat of bills and he's trying to put them down to a smaller digestible vat, and then he's bringing it to us, and we try and we go through all of them, and then we decide whether, as you can see on your screen, whether we're going to support it, whether we're going to oppose it, or whether we're just going to monitor it. So what does that look like? If it is something that is very much of importance to us, like if it is a regulatory change on the way that the licensure is handled in the state of Virginia for settlement agents, for title agents, that's something that we're going to want to look at. And as long as it's, you know, not something that's we deem is going to hurt us, we're going to actively support that. You know, that's something that's coming from our regulators, and they are going to ask for our input, and we're going to say yes. It's going to be very important that we actively support that. If it's a piece of legislation that we think is going to hurt a segment of our industry, then we're going to actively oppose it. And we'll talk in a second about what that looks like. And then the vast majority of legislation that comes through that we're just going to mark it as monitor. So it may touch our industry, but we don't need to necessarily take a position on it. And a good example of that is if there's a group that is asking for a tax exemption on the recordation of a deed. Sometimes, you know, almost every year we have a couple of those that come forward, and it's usually, you know, a protected group like veterans, you know, or a deed for no consideration. Also, all of the tax exemption statutes, something like that they're adding to, we're just going to monitor it, because we want to report back to our industry that, hey, you know, this is here. It did pass. It was signed into law, and so we want to be able to tell folks about it. But we don't necessarily, you know, we don't care one way or the other if it passes or not. So that's when we're going to put it in the monitor category. So let's talk about those categories and what that looks like. So if we are actively supporting a piece of legislation, then that means we really feel like our industry has a stake in the outcome of that. Like this is important to our industry, and we are going to spend our political capital to help pass that bill. So that's going to be our active support, and we'll talk about what active support looks like in a minute. But then we also can just passively support a piece of legislation. It may be something that another stakeholder in our industry is interested in that we support, but I'll simply saying, yeah, we support you. Like, for an example, something that the mortgage bankers may want to a piece of legislation that they want to put forth that does touch our industry. It has to do with you know, terms of a deed of trust or something. We're like, yeah, absolutely, we support you. We support that piece of legislation, and it's fine to say that we, as an industry, the Virginia Land Title Association, supports that when that other stakeholder is going and talking to other legislators to say, hey, I have this, I want your support. Here's a list of folks that support it as well. So there's a big difference between actively supporting and passively supporting. Obviously, an active support of a piece of legislation is where we're going to spend a large part of our time, definitely during the session, but also leading up to session once we find out that a piece of legislation that we do want to actively support has been brought to our attention. So what happens when we oppose a piece of legislation? Again, just like with our support, we can actively oppose a piece of legislation or we can passively oppose it. So again, if it's something that we have deemed through our review process as hurting our industry or some segment of our industry, we are going to expend our political capital. We're going to be actively speaking to the author, the sponsor of that. We're going to be talking to other stakeholders to see if they agree with us that this is not something that we want to see move forward. We're going to be talking to other members of the legislature to try and help educate them on why this is a problem. So it's the exact process when we are actively supporting. It's just that our position is a thumbs down, and we're going to try and explain why that is. And again, same thing with a passive opposition. It may just be saying, you know, no, we don't think this is a good idea, and so we're not going to support it. But we're not going to go out. We're not going to be hitting legislators up and saying we don't think you should support this. But if asked, we are going to say we do oppose this, and here are the reasons. And then, like I mentioned a minute ago, a majority of the legislation that comes through the chambers each session are pieces that we're monitoring, like the example I gave with the tax exemption. We just want to see where it goes. So that's where we spend a lot of time trying to see where it is in the process. Did it make it out of subcommittee? If it made it out of subcommittee, did it make it out of the full committee and onto the floor? And so those are the things that James spends a lot of time updating the legislative committee and executive board on during session. So we just talked a lot about a minute ago about political capital. And so what is that? What do we as an association, what is our political capital? Well, it's the resources that we use as an organization. It is the goodwill that we have worked hard to build up over the years with our legislators, with other stakeholders in our industry, such as I mentioned the bankers, the mortgage brokers, the realtors, the clerks. All of those groups have their own association, and they all have their own lobbyists who are helping, see legislation through just like we are. So we actively work to build coalitions with all of those various groups so that if they do have a piece of legislation that is either good or bad that we want to support or oppose, we have those open lines of communication to explain and help support, or help explain why this is why we can't give them their support, our support. So so what are some of the other examples of political capital? Well, trust. Do the legislators that we are actively talking to, do they trust us as an association to provide them with accurate information? So if we go to them and say, hey, this bill is great, and here's why we need it, and here is the problem that this legislation is trying to address, they need to believe us. They need to believe that this is a problem and this is going to help the citizens of their district. Because remember, that's the whole point. That's the whole point of why they're there. And so we have to make it applicable to their, to their constituents. We have to have a reasonable position. If we are actively opposing something, is that reasonable? Or are we just kind of being stubborn and we just want our way and we just think this is a bad idea? Or are we basing this on good facts? And if so, what are we willing to do? You know, is it that the language needs to be tweaked because the current language has what we believe to be unintended consequences if it's passed as is? Or is just the whole concept very problematic? So we can't just go and say, no, we oppose it, this is a terrible idea, you need to kill this. We have to be willing to say, here's the problems, and will you work with us? You know, can we possibly propose some different language? And we also have to have a logical nexus between the advocates and the issue. So legislators expect, you know, certain groups to advocate on issues that truly impact them. So are we in our lane? Are we staying in our lane? Because if we're perceived to be lobbying on an effort that just really doesn't seem germane to us, we're not going to be seen as legitimate when it comes time for an issue that really, really is important to us. We also have to have a really good working relationship with our legislators. Do they know us? You know, do they know the members of our organization, especially ones who are constituents of their district? Very, very important. And that is exactly why we have our lobbying day on the Hill each year, because that is our opportunity to come and show the legislators that we are important, that we do have support from our membership, and that they are there to help educate the legislators. And also so the legislators can put a face to a name, to the name of an organization. They all know James, but do they know us? They want to see that we are there, that we are taking our time away from our paid jobs that we all have, because this issue and our industry is important. And we want to show them that we're there, that we're going to stand up, and we're going to help educate them about our industry, about what we do. There are hundreds of associations in Virginia and only a handful of legislators. So there's a lot of us and not a lot of them. So we have to work really hard to help create a positive experience for that legislator when they are dealing with us, when we're coming to them and saying, we have this issue, or we just want you to know who we are. We're here if you ever have a constituent that has a problem, or if someone comes to you and asks you to sponsor legislation that could affect our industry, come to us. We're happy to help you draft that. We're happy to help give you facts, share our insight and our expertise, so that maybe we aren't surprised when we see a piece of legislation filed and we go, where did this come from? We're hoping to build those relationships so that they come to us ahead of time, so that we can help cut off some potential problems down the road. Like, for example, the foreign adversary bill that we had to deal with last year, which completely slid under our radar and had some terrible unintended consequences. And so we had to work very hard in a very short period of time after the bill had already passed. So we had to use all of these things. We had to expend a tremendous amount of our political capital as an association to work out that problem, so that we weren't left with a law that was terrible and that really would have impacted the ability for a lot of us to do our jobs adequately. This last note is really important. All political positions on legislation extend political capital to some degree, because even passive support or opposition, we need to consider that carefully, because it is political. And if we are going to passively oppose a piece of legislation, it doesn't settle well with the legislator who sponsored it and with the other legislators who are in favor of it. And they kind of remember that. You know, they have a long memory when it comes to folks who oppose them, even if passively. So we don't take that lightly, you know, and that's why we talked about a majority, the biggest chunk of our legislation is going to fall in that monitoring category. But even within that, we may offer to reach out to legislators to say, we see this, we know about it, we're just going to kind of sit back, but if you have questions, feel free to come to us. So hand in hand with creating the our political capital, because we have to create it, it's not just out there, we have to build it, is effective advocacy. So when does advocacy begin? So it begins, like James talked about earlier, the second that we identify a piece of legislation that could affect us, we're going to decide which bucket it goes in. Actively support, passively support, actively oppose, passively oppose, or monitor. So that begins. This is, of course, the very most important part of this is if we are going to oppose a bill, like with the foreign ownership bill last year, something that we have to actively oppose. It's very important that we begin our advocacy as soon as possible, because that's when we're going to be most effective when we get ahead of the issue instead of playing catch up and playing defense at the very end. We always are going to want to contact, like I mentioned, the other stakeholders to see where they stand on a piece of legislation. And we are often working with those groups to either address the concerns or to try and kill the bill altogether. And we have been very fortunate in the last several years that we have been extremely successful in killing pieces of legislation that were just totally unnecessary, or we're going to have unintended consequences. So, but killing a bill is really the last resort. First, we want to try and see if we can fix it, right? Fixing it is going to be the best course of action, and it is going to a lot of times use a lot of our political capital, but it also means that we're working closely with the other stakeholders. So again, that's why James is so vital to what we do, because he is working hard to build those coalitions with the other lobbyists for the other stakeholders that I mentioned earlier, to be sure that we're all sharing information and that they're coming to him and saying, hey, my group's thinking about doing this. What do you think? So we want to be sure, like we mentioned, that when we are expending our political capital, that we're doing it the right way. We want to be sure that we're briefing the members of the subcommittee where the bill is going to first be introduced, and then possibly the subsequent full committee, so that those members, those are the first members that are going to see it. And so those are the folks that we've got to focus on reaching in a timely manner and in a respectful manner as well. We can't just go in guns blazing and say, hey, we hate this. And that can be really time consuming, but it is one of the vital parts of playing offense versus playing defense. Sometimes when working with legislators, especially in the subcommittee phase, if they have asked us to participate in helping them build support, they will ask us to come, a member of our legislative committee, James, myself, a couple of others, to come and testify before the committee and help explain why this is necessary, if we are actively supporting, or if we are actively opposing, why this is a problem. And so that's when we will get together and we'll go down, a couple of us will go down and share our expertise in the industry and give practical examples of what the harm that could be caused if the bill was passed as is. But the goal is to always have an outcome decided on a bill before it's heard in committee, because we don't want to be surprised. So again, so much of what we do is doing our homework before anything happens. And so that's why being a part of the legislative committee and reading through the bills and that James identifies, and attending legislative meetings, especially during session when we meet weekly, is so important, because the more eyes we have and the more participation we have, from different segments of our membership, underwriters like myself, lay settlement agents, attorneys, settlement attorneys, title examiners, realtors, anyone who has a different piece of the puzzle of making a closing happen. They're all going to see and have different expertise. So that's why we really encourage folks to be active and participating in the legislative committee. So we have a few do's and don'ts of committee testimony, and I'm not going to read through all of these, but you all can see them on your screen. And as you can guess, it's just minding your P's and Q's. We don't want to be overly emotional. We want to stick to facts. We don't want to let legislators kind of bait us into being overly emotional or saying anything that could be perceived as critical of them or their work. And the last point on here, opposing a bill late in the process is a cardinal sin and should be avoided at all costs. And that is exactly what we got caught in last year with the foreign ownership bill. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean that we can't do something about it. We never throw our hands up, until the ink is dry from the governor signing a bill or the time expires for which he can veto it. We're going to try. We're still going to work really, really hard on that. But we obviously, as I've mentioned several times now, we want to be on the front end, not the back end. So James, are you taking this one or am I? I've lost track.
I'll take it.
Okay, great.
So, Katherine talked about getting to know your legislator, right? That's really important for political capital. It's really important for trust. Does the legislator know who you are? Like you said, they all know me, but they don't know all of you. So building a relationship is worth its weight in gold. Legislators love having people with expertise that they can call on to run ideas by. And really inviting legislators to where you work, setting up appointments either during session or even better after session when you have all the time you want with them is the way to do that. They love having people that can vote for them and actually be advocates on their behalf so other people vote for them. They love that kind of stuff. And so if you can do it, you definitely should. Because your legislators can, and they should, be your biggest advocates. So invite them to your offices to see what you do, explain your issues and your concerns, and most importantly, offer to be a resource to them for title-related issues. Katherine, go ahead. So a couple of ways you can build a relationship: in-office visits after session. Those are great because during session, that's great too, but you're going to have 10, 15 minutes with them, and they're going to have 5 people to talk to after you leave. So if you can do it after session when you get 30 minutes or an hour with a legislator, that helps a lot. Inviting legislators to your workplace, we've already talked about that, and invite legislators to your professional meetings, right? Legislators like doing that also. They like meeting a wide range of people that can possibly vote for them or have an organization that is supportive of them when it's time for them to run for their reelection. So Virginia actually is what we call a really good sunshine state. And that means there's a lot of legislative information online to just regular lay people. And I think that this presentation has been put in the chat as a handout. So if you want to download this, these are live links here that you can go to. You would be surprised at how many people don't know who their delegate or their senator is, right? And that's sort of the first step in effective advocacy. Who is my delegate? Who is my senator for where I live? Or who is my delegate and who is my senator for where I work, right? Both of those things are important. So everybody should know that, because then you know who you have the most influence with. So the General Assembly main page is great because it has the Who's My Legislator link. The General Assembly main page also has a lot of information that's readily available. It's got the House of Delegates list with all their contact information, their district offices, their General Assembly offices, their district and general phone numbers, their email addresses. all of the standing committees, what committees they all serve on, and a ton of biographical information. The third link is what we call LIS. LIS has almost everything you could ever want to know about state government on it. Not only does it have everything the General Assembly main page has on it, but it has access to the Constitution of Virginia, the Code of Virginia, the Virginia Administrative Code. You can look up every bill that's been filed in the General Assembly since 1995. That's when they started doing electronic filing. And so it's got a whole wealth of information that you can go and use and research if you'd like. Katherine, go ahead.
James, does the General Assembly main page, is that the one also where you can navigate to the live feed of subcommittee meetings?
Yep, you sure can. So in Virginia, the actual General Assembly session, both the House and the Senate, has been live streamed for a very long time. We had just started recently in the past couple of years doing committees, and now we do subcommittees. So you can watch every single subcommittee, every single committee, every single floor session every day when they're in session if you'd like to.
Yeah, and that's really helpful for all associations, really. I mean, it's done for the citizenship, but it's really helpful for associations like us because we're spread out all over the state. And so we obviously, you know, we can't all run down the, you know, I'm lucky I am in Richmond and I can run down sometimes, but we can all sit at our desk and have that up. So if we are actively monitoring a piece of legislation, we can pop that link up and watch the testimony and see what legislators are saying, because a lot of times comments will come out in subcommittee about a piece of legislation that we're monitoring that we're like, whoa, I'm not sure they know that this bill is doing what it's really going to do. And then that's, again, someplace that we may have to step in and say, hey, just, you know, we may need to do some education of the legislator. Or we may think that we're in really good shape on a piece of legislation, and then we see in subcommittee that there was some negative comments there, you know, and that helps us address that. So it's great that we can all watch that, you know, sitting from the comfort of our desk.
So the other thing that we have really just very recently started doing, and this happened during the pandemic, is that they now allow for virtual testimony. You have to sign up for that the day before. You can also provide written comment to the committee, which is something we had never done before. So the ability of just everyday folk that can't travel to Richmond and sit around and wait for a bill to come up, their ability to advocate for the things they like and the things they believe in has increased tremendously over the last few years.
Yeah, so not everything is bad that came out of COVID.
Right.
You know, we're kind of forced to bring things into the 21st century. So those are all very positive aspects.
So we're going to move on to the budget. Virginia works off of a biennial budget, and so we do that in every even numbered session. So the 2024 session is obviously an even numbered session, and so we will be tasked with developing a new 2-year budget. Our budgets are developed using projected revenue. So when we get more revenue than we thought we would get, we will modify the budget in the next year and we call that the caboose budget. But if we have less revenue than we thought we were going to get, we're going to cut things. And that's always a little bit harder than adding money to stuff. This is going to be a really difficult year for the Commonwealth, fiscally speaking, because even though we have really robust revenues, we are losing a lot of money in federal funding. So a lot of money that stemmed from the pandemic for healthcare, for education, a lot of things that we have used, what we call the TANF surplus to fund, all of that's going away. And to top it off, there is a fear of a pending recession out there. And so what that means is we have hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue to replace for existing programs. And the General Assembly is scared that we're going to hit a recession, which means they are very, very hesitant to spend new money. So this budget, I think, is going to be really difficult for us to develop, not only because of the fiscal state of the Commonwealth, but also because the legislative branch is controlled by Democrats and the executive branch is controlled by a Republican Governor Youngkin. And their spending priorities are not going to match up very well. We've, over the past 6 or 7 years, had a fairly difficult time developing a budget anyway. But this time, I think it's going to be pretty tough. So the governor releases his initial budget on December 20th. So once that's released, we'll review that to see if there's anything that impacts the title industry. And then we will wait for the General Assembly, the House of Delegates, and the Senate to modify the governor's budget into what they think it ought to be. And the budget will be the very last thing that is completed by the end of the 2024 session, if they can complete it by the end, which I kind of doubt they will. I think we're going to go into overtime with the budget this year as well. Go ahead, Katherine.
James, can you talk about what that looks like, what it means when they, go over and they don't have a budget, and talk about special sessions a little bit?
Yeah, so generally they'll do one of two things. They will either adjourn and go into pro forma session, which means the session's really ongoing. You just have to have some votes from some members to keep it going, or they will adjourn regular session. They will go into special session. And they will call special session when the budget conferees decide that they have a deal. The governor will call the General Assembly back, and then they will vote on the budget. In Virginia, if we don't have our budget by June 30th, then we revert to the previous budget. And the previous budget is always out of whack with what the actual spending needs of the state are. So we've never hit that cliff, but we've come close a couple of times in the recent past. And so I think what is probably likely is they will not finish the budget on time, or they will, and the governor is going to have a lot of changes that he wants to it. So I think it's going to be a messy situation. We will likely go into special session for the budget, but we're hopeful that we're not going to hit the June 30th cliff. So we've got something in the chat from Stephanie Vermillion. She asks if we will know what bills are up for discussion when we go to Richmond in February. And the answer to that is yes. All bills that are going to be considered by the General Assembly will be done and filed before the end of the second week in January. So we will know every piece of legislation that's been submitted and is under consideration by the time we do Day on the Hill.
Yeah. So the legislator has a cutoff date, and so once that date passes and it's January 17th, something like that, no more bills can be filed. So at that point, we know the entire body of proposed legislation for this session. So we know how big that is at that point. So yes, we will 100% know every bill. Now, that's when the monitoring becomes very important, because we will have identified all of our bills, and then they're all going to be moving through subcommittees and committees and chambers at a different rate. So that's when it really, the puppet show begins.
All right, so we're going to switch over to talk about the elections that we just had on November 7th. So it was a historic election year, and there are several reasons for that. So in 2022, the General Assembly passed a nonpartisan redistricting law that was tasked with redistricting the Commonwealth's Senate seats, House of Delegates seats, and congressional districts without regard to incumbency. And that actually caused a lot of problems because there were several instances, many instances, where two sitting incumbent legislators of the same party were drawn into the same legislative district. So for example, here in Richmond, we had a district that included 3 incumbent Democrats, Delegate Jeff Bourne, Delegate Betsy Carr, and Delegate Dawn Adams. So they all can't run. So what you have is you have a primary and you fight it out with your former friend as to who should be the Democrat representing that area. So because of this, because legislators don't really like fighting with each other, at least, if you're in the same party, many legislators opted to just retire and say, my political career is done, I'm just going to hang it up. So there was monumental turnover after the 2023 elections, and even before the 2023 elections. So before we even got to election day, we lost 40% of our incumbent senators, right? To include almost all of the leadership. Dick Saslaw, who was the majority leader for the Democrats, retired. Tommy Norment, who was the minority leader for the Republicans, retired. Janet Howell, who was chairwoman of Senate Finance and Appropriations, retired. There were just a lot of people that said, you know what, my time in politics is done and I'm just going to go. So we lost 40% of our members in the Senate, to include a lot of leadership and a lot of institutional knowledge. Katherine, go ahead, please. So we look at the House of Delegates and it was almost the same, right? The House of Delegates lost 32% of its members, even before Election Day. And you can see how, you know, this broke out. 17 retired, 14 sought other office. Those 14 people ran for Senate seats, right? So they're leaving the House of Delegates, they're going to the Senate, but even if elected to the Senate, they lose all of their seniority. So they're just brand new members. And one lost their primary. So what does this mean for us? What this means is there was a huge loss of institutional knowledge. You know, people that sat on committees and heard issues and were familiar with industries and familiar with their lobbyists and their members that are now just gone, right? And so there is a lot of education that we all have to do. Everybody has to do with all of these new members, and, you know, compounded by the very short time to consider legislation and have it filed has made for a very busy off season since after the November 7th elections. But we're working through that, and this will be a very interesting session as all these new members of the General Assembly sort of get acclimated to their new roles. And as we've already said, Democrats control both chambers of the General Assembly now, although with one seat majorities. One seat majority is still a majority. And so what does that mean? That means, so we'll take the House of Delegates, for example, which was formerly under Republican control. So now there is a new Speaker of the House, and that's Delegate Don Scott out of Portsmouth. We call him the Speaker designee. There will be a new majority leader. That is Delegate Charnel Herring out of Fairfax. There will be a new minority leader, who is Delegate Todd Gilbert out of Shenandoah, who is the former Speaker of the House. Technically, he's still the Speaker until the first day of session, but he's on his way out. What that means in the House is all new committee chairs, all new subcommittee chairs, and when you lose 32% of your members or 40% of your members, like in the Senate, the way that committees look is going to be vastly, vastly different. So in the Senate, on Senate Finance and Appropriations, only 5 members of that committee are still there, right? And so that is a huge turnover on a 21-member committee. So, like I said, a lot of work for us all to do to educate all of these new members on our priorities. Go ahead, Katherine. Well, that's the end.
Yes, yeah, so that's really kind of where we are with everything. But I think it's really important to kind of take in what James just said a second ago about the tremendous turnover that we have. So we just spent a whole bunch of time talking about our political capital and how we build it and what we do to create it. And that is the relationship building with the members. And we have so many new members. So ones that we may have been working with for years that knew us and that we could rely on to support us, that trusted, remember we talked about trust being a huge issue, that trusted that the information we would give them on a piece of legislation was reliable. We don't have that with all of these new members. So we're really starting from the ground up with 32% and 40%. I mean, that's huge. And we are a smaller industry, right? We are a smaller association. So we've got to work really hard to, you know, get that exposure with these new members. I mean, they are being thrown into a hot pot of water just to do their everyday job with the shortened, time period between bills being filed and the beginning of session. And we already, have one of the shortest sessions in the country. So, I mean, it is just off to the races. So it's really important. It's important every year, but some years are really more important than others. And I think this is a really important year. We want to be sure that we get in front of these new members and offer any assistance and any support that we can, and just really kind of get some name recognition with these folks. So Lobby Day is definitely going to be important, and it's going to be busy because every other association worth their salt is going to be doing the same thing because they know the facts as well. So there's going to be a lot of folks vying for these legislators' attention. So we want to be sure that we bring a good and educated and confident group of folks to Lobby Day. But that being said, it is not a scary thing. These are just regular people. They're citizen legislators. They're not, you know, the Queen Mother Mary. They're just average people. I mean, every time that I've gone into one of these meetings, they've all been very gracious if we're meeting with them, or a lot of times we're meeting with a staff member. They're very gracious. They're very nice. They you know, they want to hear from us, and you just never know what small connection you may be able to make with one of the legislators. I mean, I remember one time going in with 2 other members of VLTA, and this particular legislator was a big fisherman and had tons of fish up on the wall and pictures of him fishing. And, you know, the other VLTA member that I was with was a huge fisherman as well. So they immediately were able to hit it off based on that common interest. And, you know, you could just see the demeanor of the legislator change, because like, oh, this is like one of my people, like this is one of my fishermen, I'm going to listen to what he has to say. So you just never know what may spark that you know, that connection. So it's not a scary thing. You don't have to be a professional lobbyist. You just have to be passionate about what you do. And I think everyone, if you're a member of VLTA, you know, you're already a little bit passionate. You know, you picked this career. So I would encourage anyone who is on our webinar today that hasn't done Lobby Day, give it a try. There are plenty of us who have done it before. We'll partner you with folks that have done it before. It is not scary. It's kind of fun, you know. You get to see our legislative you know, prowess in action, and you get to be a part of that process, and it's really important. So we can't complain if we're not a part of the process. We can't complain about the outcome if we're not willing to participate. So yeah, so that's my stump speech. Anything else, James?
No, I think that's it. Thank you everybody for coming in. And if you guys think of any questions that you didn't ask, I'm happy to answer those. You can get my email from, I believe, the VLTA website. And so if you've got something for me, just shoot it to me. Happy to answer anything you might have.
Yeah, and anyone who's interested in signing up for Lobby Day that hasn't already, all the information is on the website. The link to register is there. So I would highly encourage you to do that. And as James said, if you have any other questions afterwards, direct them to VLTA, direct them to James, direct them to myself. My email is really easy. It's kcrawford@firstam.com. Happy to answer those. And so, yeah. So that's it. We'll give you 5 minutes back in your day.
Thank you, Katherine and James, and for everyone attending today. This will be recorded, so I'll send out the link once this has been processed on demand. And like Katherine and James said, feel free to shoot me an email as well if you have any questions about today's session. My email is going to be super easy too, just vlta@vlta.org.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
All right,
See
bye.
ya.